Thank you very much. I particularly want to thank Professor Lim and Professor Khan for organizing this important event and inviting me. And I also want to mention that last night during dinner, there was a lot of joking and banter around the resources to build the Asia Center and how it may not be enough, that it would be. So I was wondering whether the laughing was because the building would be small and just held up by 4 pillars or something like that. And that is in fact, of course, what Professor Khan very modestly said, yes, it's very small, too small. But now I know that the laughing was because it was ironic. So, but nonetheless, I'm very pleased to see that this very important project has the wherewithal and the infrastructure to take it forward. Now, the title of my talk is, and I will try to be short, is called The Agenda of Asian Studies in the Anthropocene. This is a word, a new word, so we're all trying to figure out how it should be properly pronounced. But just for those of you who may not be familiar, it refers to an era, because the dates are controversial, to an era where humans make a difference to their natural environment more than any other force that we know. It could be that the natural forces will overtake the role of the humans, but this is it. Of course, the argument is whether it began with the beginning of agriculture, or whether it began with the beginning of industrialization, or whether it began just in the last 150 years. So, having cleared those issues, let me make one final clarification. Is that some of you may be, I hope you're not, but may be offended that the topic is slightly normative, that I do present something which I wish the field could move to. But of course, that is normative for me, not for you. And what I mean by that is that I think that we should have a kind of a paradigm change from modernization theory or national modernization to something like a sustainable modernity. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you are not allowed to do the kinds of work that you've been doing, and paradigm changes always happen only after it's taken place for a long time. Somebody has to come along and give it a big push or something. But what I want to suggest is think of how, we think of modernization theory and what I call, incidentally, I would also like to say that I don't know if it's there in my biography to read it, but I must put in a plug for a new book that I've just finished and submitted to Cambridge the day before coming here, so I haven't had a chance to prepare too much for here. But it is called, it is related to the theme. It is called The Crisis of Global Modernity, Asian Traditions and a Sustainable Future. It had some other title, but the Cambridge syndics said, oh, this would probably sell better. But so that's how they moved it. At any rate, to come to the topic immediately. Oh, I was saying about modernization theory. So we think of it just as a theory. But of course, if you think of it in every way and shape, all our assumptions, all our ideas, our sub-ideas are shaped by that paradigm, right? And we still, although we don't like to use the word anymore perhaps, but we're still driven by those ideas. And I don't mean just of growth and GDP and this, that, and the other, but I also mean, small things like, what does it mean for personal ethics to do something that is modern, that is not, as opposed to traditional or non-modern or something? How do we justify it? So that's the level of paradigm I think that we need to think of if we want to have a change and a sustainable planet. A personal starting point. I wrote a book in 1995 called Rescuing History from the Nation. Within 10 years of having written it, I realized that the decoupling of history and the nation state, a relationship which had been so intimate for at least 100 years, had become quite acceptable to academics in the West, largely because the nation state was not nearly as dependent on the national historical narrative as it had been in the earlier part of the century. Although the advanced economies of the West clearly occupied a different moment in globalization than the developing economies of the rest of the world, by and large, the nation state had begun to be involved as much in the neoliberal projects of globalization, privatization, and revenue generation as in projects of national building, identity building, and development. Before turning to Asian studies and the Anthropocene, let us consider the changing status of the humanistic disciplines, and by that I mean the interpretive social sciences as well. So what is the changing status of humanities and social sciences globally? The sea change in the status and role of HSS, I'll just call it HSS for short, by the late 1990s may be most apparent actually in its birthplace in Europe, which produced the Humboldtian model of education, conception of education. The Humboldtian philosophy sought to unify teaching and research. It institutionalized freedom of research and study and promoted humanistic and individualistic values. This conception became well suited to nation states to cultivate models of individual and social development, especially in the US, where it became tied to liberal arts education at the collegiate level. Today, in most European countries, teaching has been severed from research. Funding for the latter is increasingly dependent on competition for large grants, in which the individual researcher plays a specialized role based on the natural sciences model. The criteria of evaluation may also be unsuitable for HSS work with long-term impact. In perhaps less dramatic ways, several of these trends are also affecting the US and Asia and Australia as well. The role of this position paper then is to explore the changing status and role of HSS. Although the requirements and role of different HSS disciplines may vary, nonetheless, the absence of a broad view of the larger changes taking place has caused considerable confusion and even despair in our disciplines. So what I want to do is take a dispassionate view of the changing global context and reevaluate its role. Most proximately, the questions that affect us have to do with the costs and advantages that the new models of research have upon our scholarly practices and methods. Does this model permit us to understand more fully human and planetary development, including the understanding of moral, aesthetic, emotional, visual, ethical, and critical dimensions of life? Can we incorporate the qualitative, rhetorical, and interpretive modes of understanding a phenomenon as much as a technical and an instrumental role? Do the delivery cycles of contemporary grant systems tolerate the longer immersion in the materials and writings that our fields require? How can we identify and utilize new opportunities being opened up by data mining and data visualization technologies to expand the horizons of our research methods? More significantly, the paper invites us to locate our disciplines and methods anew in the changing global context. This is not necessarily a call to relocate all our research in transnational or global spaces. Rather, the impact of globalization has invited us to rethink the nation as a framework of inquiry. Thus, the local in today's world, and in many ways retrospectively, is shaped by forces at different global scales and by their interactions. How can we conceptualize an alternative to methodological nationalism? What are the implications of such an alternative conceptualization? What is the new geography of power to which academic knowledge production has to or should answer? To what extent can we still afford to have ethical responsibilities in our research, and how can we make our case collectively and globally? The question of ethics returns us to one of the most crucial questions in the transitions of academic models of inquiry. The Humboldtian model encouraged a reflexive mode of inquiry, connected to individuals and individualistic and humanistic values. While we now recognize that these values were framed largely by national and other goals compatible with the national interest, nonetheless, the autonomy permitted a critical reflexivity towards understanding those segments of the population or sectors of society and experience that cannot be adequately grasped by the dominant model of instrumental rationality. Martha Nussbaum, my old colleague at Chicago, has argued that humanistic knowledge is fundamentally about promoting compassion and sympathy. Although, as we have seen, for example, in Nazi social science and aesthetics, it is not only about that. We might develop that line to suggest that humanistic knowledge furnishes a more holistic account and may well have inherited this from the role of religion, of life that includes the effect and impact of rational and technical modes of intervention. We believe it is this holistic understanding which is the best basis for evaluative decision making. Thus, while there may be many reasons for promoting humanistic education, such as flexible citizenship and growing multiculturalism in the world, it is the capacity for reflection upon the wider conditions and needs of humanity that is among the most important roles for humanities and social sciences. In this context, the humanities and interpretive sciences will need to find new platforms to cooperate with the harder sciences. I noticed that is an agenda project, as well as those in the newer professional and applied schools who are interested in real-world social problems. Finally, HSS should also develop new themes that illustrate how the changing world generates new agendas for research. One such theme may be sovereignty and sustainability. Today, many emerging problems in the world are regional and global, connected to climate change, population, disease, financial movements, among many others. However, institutions that might address these problems still remain largely national. Just as modernization theory developed a worldwide agenda to address problems of development in the era of nation states, there is a need to develop theories and methodologies to grasp how we may be entering an era of shared sovereignty, questions of ethical commitment to it, and technologies of cultivating identities and commitments to larger goals such as sustainability. Now I come to the section that I call Asia and the Paradigm of Sustainable Modernity. Let me briefly review the existing paradigm of Asian studies that emerged in the US in the post-war period. Despite the name of Asia, the focus has been on national modernization paradigm, where both nation building and modernization were the normative goals. The reality, however, began to change with the new round of globalization, especially after the Cold War. Globalization was accompanied by regional formations. All over the world, regions have emerged strongly after the Cold War. All we need to think of is Europe, NAFTA, because Europe began earlier, but it certainly took off after. NAFTA, Mercosur, and now Asia. In the last couple of decades, particularly with the Asian financial crisis, since the Asian financial crisis, the emergence of integrated supply chain networks and the rise of China and other Asian societies, trade and cultural connections have rapidly increased. There have been growing integration of 16 Asian countries, including ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and India. Before 1998, trade between these Asian countries was 33%. In the 10 years after 1998, it went up to 52% and is perhaps much higher today. ASEAN will become a major regional bloc, drawing various different Asian and global powers to itself, and its core principles in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, TAC, including China, India, Japan, and others. The goal of ASEAN is to achieve long-term peace by creating responsibilities and obligations among powers to act within their normative scheme. Whatever their weaknesses, they have sought to tie down the powers and benefit materially by treaties and FTAs and other arrangements such as ASEAN Plus 3, EAS, APEC, ARF, now you have the Regional East Asian Cooperation, you have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all of these kinds of things we won't have to go into. But they have done so through a policy of enmeshment and commercial diplomacy. Of course, the recent tendency towards unilateralism on the part of China has been a complicating factor. But overall, the arrangement still holds. ASEAN is creating the basis of an open and inclusive regionalism, which creates commitments to regional prosperity and peace, but is a much looser architecture than the European Union, which may sometimes resemble a supra-nation state. It resembles to a limited extent the maritime Asian trade networks because of the separation of political, economic, and military levels and power. The new linkages across Asia represent a kind of networked region. Historically, Asia was a networked region. It was first interlinked by land and later the maritime Silk routes. Of course, there were empires that sustained or destroyed these links, but it was through trade, religious networks, and enormous civilization and technological connections were forged and practices disseminated. I propose that the network model is different from other regional models, which presuppose a modern space of territorial homogenization. Incidentally, I have written some of these ideas in a piece called Asia Redux, which appeared in the Journal of Asian Studies in 2010, so you can always find them there. And there was a debate around it too. So I propose that this network model is, although I had not developed the network model, which I'm now working on, from other regional models which presuppose a modern space of territorial homogenization. The network model of contemporary region is made up of overlapping, intersecting networks, hubs, and hinterlands. Incredibly, as I said, they resemble the land and maritime routes. And in fact, they still resemble it to such an extent that President, not Professor, President Xi Jinping recently in November, I think, he went back to his hometown in Shanxi and started to launch the new Silk Route from the west, where he said that, yes, I remember in my childhood that from Shanxi we could smell the wisps of smoke coming from the desert, the Gobi Desert and beyond, and evoked the Silk Route in that kind of way as well. Networks may also be further distinguished by a connected but not congruent or superposed character. In the maritime network region, which people are more familiar about, the interstate networks are not superposed upon multi-level transnational agencies, NGOs, trading, labor, and cultural networks, although they are often imbricated with each other. Whatever the reasons for the emergence of network region in Asia, there were also imperatives for its development. We live in the Anthropocene, in which humans as a whole collectively determine the sustainability of the earth more than any other force. Whether because of terrorism, biological, chemical, or economic epidemics or environmental crisis, we have to transcend national interests even in order to continue to have the nation. Whether through collective national arrangements or transnational formation, the existing rules of the sovereignty game must change, and are, in fact, I think, already beginning. Regions also represent an intermediate stage between global and national levels to solve the spill-out problems, especially environmental ones, connected to global capitalism. Regions permit smaller clusterings of sovereign or semi-sovereign agencies to tackle these problems which do not respect national boundaries. Regional agencies are needed to coordinate common and linked problems of regional goods or commons. One of the most important of these is the problem of water management. The Himalayas are the watershed for 10 major Asian rivers. The Lansang in China and the Mekong in Southeast Asia has over 25 dams and many more planned across several nations. The thirst for hydropower could adversely affect the livelihood of 60 million people. The case is similar with the Nu or the Salween River and the Yalong Sangho or the Brahmaputra. On the last, the Brahmaputra that is, and I happen to be also from a part of India called Assam into which the Brahmaputra flows. On this, the Chinese North-South water transfer project to the arid region of North China will affect the flow of water to South Asia and may threaten water wars. There is clearly a need to coordinate and create transparency among sovereign states to observe and contain the effects of water flows to these countries, to other countries. Let me finally talk, since the organizers said to talk a little bit about projects, our research projects. I propose that we conduct a study of Asia under the paradigm of sustainable modernity. This is something that we have also been doing at the Institute, which I direct, called the Asia Research Institute. I have yet to develop a full proposal for it, but I'm persuaded that it will have a major transformative effect not only on Asian studies, but hopefully also in policy and decision-making centers. The national modernization paradigm has dominated scholarship in the world since World War II. It informed not only academic scholarship, but our very view of the world, and continues to do so. The paradigm switch will have to emerge from many different sources and springs, most especially the new civil society, global civil society, and its socially mediated networks that are arising across the world. Asianists will need to become thought leaders in this rather than followers. I will mention only two of the guiding rules of scholarship that will have to change. First, the nation cannot be isolated. Of course, it cannot be ignored either, but the network region that continues to share many resources and problems has to play a more important role. Second, sustainability means that we cannot devote ourselves to thinking of progress in GDP and a host of other affiliated terms that are part of the package. Even the Human Development Index may not be enough because it does not consider the irreparable loss to environment and nature. In the Asia Research Institute, which I direct, we conduct research both individually and collectively within the research clusters. These clusters include religion and globalization, Asian urbanism, Asian migration, science, technology and society, changing family, cultural studies, among others. I've also created a meta-cluster that does not necessarily employ separate researchers, but seek to coordinate the activities of researchers in the various clusters to encourage understanding of linkages across countries and across disciplines. The meta-cluster is called the Historical Sociology of Asian Connections, where we prefer the term connections to refer not only to connections within Asia, but also to connections with Asia. There are several new themes which characterize our interest in Asian today. First, as no one knows better than the Japanese climatologist, transnational solutions within and beyond Asia are the only means to secure sustainability of the world. As Nishimura Mutsuyoshi, member of the UN Secretary General's high-level advisory group on climate change, and who was very central in the first Kyoto talks, has said, climate change is an issue for you and for all of us, as nature does not make a distinction whether it comes from the US, China, and Japan. The role of developing methodologies in history, social sciences, and humanities that defy the exclusivism of methodological nationalism is to show that the world has been interdependent and formed by circulatory forces for a long time. According to the anthropologist Jack Goody, the Eurasia has been connected since the Bronze Age. As such, while we cannot deny the importance of national culture and identity, it's even more important to show that there are forces that shape and actually shape us are circulatory, regional, and global forces. Hence, the idea of sovereignty can never be exclusive, but must be shared among different units and agencies in the region and the world. Another related theme that's being developed in RE, in the Institute I direct, is disaster management. I have come to the firm belief that disaster is the new normal, and so it is not something that can just be developed by specialized agencies. In the spring of 2011, when the tsunami hit Fukushima, there were also devastating floods in Thailand. In both cases, as in most other disasters, their effects were not singular but compounded or cascading. You need no explanation of how Fukushima related to a series of mounting disasters. But Thailand's floods caused US $45 plus billion in economic losses because of severe damage to 7 industrialized regions, estates or zones, and consequently to the global supply chain. This is 20 times more than the usual insurance premium payments for Thailand. It was among the top 10 global insured losses by value ever, and represented more than, as I said, 20 times Thailand's annual property premiums. Secondary or reflexive modernization in developed societies like Japan, according to Ulrich Beck, refers to the management of the unforeseen consequences of earlier rounds of modernization. These effects are further compounded by natural disasters and industrialization in developing countries. Accidents and natural disasters compound each other across the region and the world. This is true globally, but it's particularly the case in Asia and Southeast Asia, where megacity developments is unchecked. In this context, we will not only need technical researchers, but those capable of studying history, ethics, local knowledge, governance, and social capital, among others. The humanities has, together with all forms of knowledge from the 20th century, been essentially driven by the paradigm of modernization, no matter how deeply archaic or textual our studies have been. The goal today must be to change that paradigm from modernization theory, including affiliated ideas like development, state building, nationalism, or neoliberal economics, to one of sustainable modernity. The task ahead of us is to imagine how we might rethink our disciplines in the light of this new paradigm. Thank you.